Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Dan Schnur Political Report. For those of you who would like to submit questions to Dan, there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen where you can type in your questions, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. Dan, we have a really terrific topic today, and I want to give you every second to respond to all of the questions of our audience. So why don't you come on and we'll talk about abortion in America. What happens after Roe versus Wade?
We do have a lot to talk about, Kim, don't we?
Yes, sir. So take it away, Dan. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks as always to all of you for joining us. It seems like it's been much more than a month since we've last seen each other. And there's been a lot in the news since then that we could spend a lot of time, we can certainly spend an hour or more discussing today. We're beginning to see some signs of inflation easing. The war in Ukraine, of course, is still slogging forward. We've seen several tragic shootings, most recently yesterday, just outside of Chicago, Illinois. And of course, the January 6th congressional hearings have been teaching us much more about that fateful day than we'd ever known before. And even if we were to limit our conversation just to the US Supreme Court, we could devote at least an hour each on their decisions on guns, on environmental protections, on religion, and on other critical topics on which they've ruled in this session. There's a new leader in Israel, there's new belligerents from China, possible additional missile capability in North Korea, and other important news that's come out of Latin America and Asia and Africa and Europe over the last 30 days. And for the sizable portion of our group that is from the greater Los Angeles area, we have final numbers from our mayoral primary here that shows Representative Karen Bass in a much stronger position for the runoff than we thought when we gathered to talk about this at the beginning of June. And so while one single hour isn't nearly enough time to discuss the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade, we'll devote at least the first half of today's webinar to that topic. And while, of course, Rachel and I will be more than happy to discuss other issues with you, when we move to the question and answer portion of the webinar at the bottom of the hour, my guess is that we'll spend most of today's discussion on the topic of abortion. So right away, if we can, let's, Rachel, Claire, can we post our first question and see where the group comes down on the basic issue here? Well, right away, everybody, in straightforward yes or no, do you agree with the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade? Now, we know from past experience that our group, primarily coming from a blue state and a bluer portion of that blue state, does tend to lean somewhat leftward. But just as a basis, before we go off into other aspects of the discussion and other questions for all of you, we thought it would be good to get a good sense on this question. And look at that. Wow, 94% of our group disagrees with the Roe decision. 6% says it was the right thing to do. And so not a great surprise on that. But again, let's use that as a jumping off point as we go further. So first, let's start with some basics. We know that since the decision was made just a week ago Friday, that already 13 states that had previously passed so-called trigger laws have already moved forward or are already moving forward to either outlaw or severely restrict abortion in their states. It's believed that roughly the same number of states, although they don't have those immediate trigger laws, will be acting in the months ahead. And so what is widely assumed is once the dust is settled, as it were, over the next several months, we'll see roughly a 50-50 split in this country, in which 25 or so states continue to allow abortion on the same or a similarly non-restricted basis as we currently see in the country. And roughly half the states, 25 or 26, that will either outlaw or severely restrict its availability. Now, Joe Biden, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later, has been talking very frequently about how this makes the midterm elections more important. And he's been urging voters to elect more Democrats to Congress so that the House of Representatives and Senate can pass national abortion protections through legislation as opposed to through the courts. But between now and then, between now and November, the Biden administration is concentrating primarily in two areas. One, on protecting the ability of women to travel from a state that restricts or outlaws abortion to one that still allows the procedure to be performed illegally. And there's all sorts of back and forth between the states about what kind of restrictions a state that outlaws abortion can impose on a woman's ability to travel. But Biden has been very clear, as has Attorney General Merrick Garland, that because these are interstate questions, the the Justice Department feels very strongly that a woman's right to travel for an abortion will be protected by the federal government, regardless of the laws in the state in which she is based. The other priority that the Biden administration is focusing on is the availability of medical abortion, abortion pills, and specifically the question about whether such medication can be sent by mail to women in a state that restricts or outlaws abortion. And once again, some of the likely pro-life states have made it very clear that they believe this is a violation of their laws. But just as the Biden Justice Department has said very strongly that they believe protections exist for transportation for an expectant mother, the Department of Health and Human Services has made it equally clear in equally strong terms that the ability of a woman to access a medical abortion, even not in a state that continues to allow the procedure, is something that they will work very hard to protect. Many of these questions will end up in the courts and be debated not just for months, but for years. But those, at least right now, seem to be the Biden administration's two priorities. And of course, Biden himself has also called for a suspension of the filibuster, requiring 60 votes in the United States Senate to pass legislation. He's called for not the elimination of the filibuster, as so many have urged him over the last year and a half, but a suspension to pass national abortion legislation. And we'll talk more about that a bit later also. Congress, particularly Nancy Pelosi, in addition to these two areas, transportation and medication, has been talking a lot already about passing legislation to protect online activity from women looking for information about abortion. There's right now a lot of that data available through Facebook and Google and otherwise may be available to law enforcement authorities in these states. And Pelosi has already been urging the relevant committees in Congress to move as quickly as possible to establish protections for that data. The next question to come up is legislation. Biden, as I mentioned a moment ago, has talked about electing larger Democratic majorities this fall in order to pass national abortion protections through legislation. But a bill could pass between now and November, and we'll come back to that in just a little bit also once we finish this overview. And then finally, before we get to your questions at the bottom of the hour, I want to talk at least briefly about the potential impact of this decision on the November elections. I've already mentioned what Biden is talking about. Republicans believe their advantage in terms of regaining majorities in the House and Senate are very strong, and we'll wade through that also, both in the conclusion of my presentation, but I'm also guessing during the Q&A when we get to go on to your questions. Now, one thing, but where I want to go first, before we even get to that, is I want to look back in history just a bit. Back when Roe versus Wade was first passed in the 1970s, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who arguably has been the strongest feminist and the strongest proponent of abortion rights ever to serve on the US Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, back in the 1970s, long before she joined the court herself, argued that Roe versus Wade was incorrect. And she believed that the question of whether abortion should be legal in this country should be decided not in courts by judges, but rather in legislatures by elected officials. Now, given Ginsburg's very strong credentials on this issue, it's not widely known that this is a position that she'd taken, but she was very clear and wrote on this and spoke on this frequently, that the 7 justices who voted in favor of Roe back in 1973 had acted imprudently and incorrectly. And just to clarify, Ginsburg's disagreement, of course, was certainly not with the substance of their ruling. She strongly believed in the importance of establishing national protections for a woman's right to have an abortion. But Ginsburg also strongly believed that the court should have stopped before going quite that far. For those of you who either remembered this or have refreshed your memories over the last 10 days, the Roe versus Wade bill itself was based on a Texas law that would have banned almost all abortions in that state. And that became the basis for the Roe versus Wade decision. And Ginsburg argued that the court should have overruled the Texas law, but it should have stopped there. And that by not just reversing the Texas ruling, but by also using the case to establish a nationwide right to an abortion, she felt that the justices dramatically overstepped, and her concern was that her argument was that allowing the abortion debate to be resolved gradually through the legislative process would have allowed the ability to gradually build public consensus rather than to immediately impose that decision on a divided country. And she believed that passing abortion protection legislatively would have created a more durable and a more sustainable base of support for reproductive rights. And she worried that concluding such a divisive public argument that abruptly would balkanize the political landscape, effectively freezing public opinion in place on both sides of the issue. And of course, she was exactly right. She correctly predicted both broad resentment to the decision and ongoing backlash against it. And in Ginsburg's own words, I'm quoting her from a speech she gave sometime after the fact, Ruth Bader Ginsburg said the following, quote, "A less encompassing Roe, one that merely struck down the extreme Texas law and went no further on that day, might have served to reduce rather than to fuel controversy," end quote. And of course, as I said, that's exactly what's happened over the last 49 years. Now, the challenge now is that the political landscape is much less amenable to the type of progress she was talking about. In the 5 years before Roe was decided, between 1968 and 1973, 16 states moved to liberalize their abortion laws. 16 states, incidentally, with 41% of the nation's population. So the political winds were clearly blowing in that direction. But then after the court acted, the battle lines hardened and the progress basically stopped. Now, one other quick aside before we go on, and if someone would like to ask a question on this, it's a fascinating discussion. In addition to believing that the court overstepped, Ginsburg also believed that the Supreme Court should have based its decision not on the right to privacy, which Justice Blackmun and his colleagues used as the rationale for the establishment of national abortion rights. But Ginsburg said it shouldn't have been a question of privacy that decided that, but rather that restrictions on abortion impeded gender equality and created an obstacle for women in the workplace and elsewhere that men did not face. And there are a great number of legal scholars who believe that by basing the argument on that concept, on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, that decision would have been better protected from the argument that the justices used a couple weeks ago in overturning it, particularly because of their citing of historical precedent. But that is a discussion for another day. So let's do this. Clara, if we can go back to the questions, let's see what our group thinks about the Ginsburg argument. So question for all of you. Do you agree with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's argument that abortion rights should be decided by elected officials, not judges? Now, again, I recognize that today in 2022 is a much different political landscape than the one 49 years ago. But I ask the question not from a standpoint of practical politics, but philosophically. Was she right or was she wrong? And Claire, what have we gotten in terms of answers from our group? Oh, this is interesting and frankly, for me, a little bit more surprising than the answers to the first question. 73% of our group, almost 3/4 of the people with us today, believe that Ginsburg was right, that this ought to be decided by elected officials and not judges. Only 27%, a little bit more than 1/4, say no. So let's build on that for a minute. Ginsburg, back in that day, and the debate today is about state legislatures acting. But the reason we're talking about state legislatures is not because Congress is not allowed to act on a question like this one, but that it can't. That because of the filibuster and the just deep divisions that exist within the United States Congress, it's very, very unlikely that a bill would pass on this subject. But constitutionally and legally, it's perfectly allowed. And while Biden has been talking, as I mentioned earlier, about electing more Democrats to Congress in November in order to enact abortion rights legislation, there's been almost no talk whatsoever from either the White House or Congress about trying to pass a bill at some point over the summer and fall. And from my own perspective, given their stated urgency of maintaining protections for legal abortion in roughly half the country where those rights are under threat, it seems very strange to me, and it's very frustrating to me, that no effort along those lines is likely to be made until after the fall election several months from now. Now, again, and I mentioned the filibuster earlier, that's obviously the biggest obstacle to legislative codification of Roe. And neither Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema, the Democratic senators who oppose the suspension of the bill of filibuster, have been moved by Biden's call to suspend it. And so the prospect, admittedly, of getting 60 votes for a compromise measure on abortion does seem remote. But hang with me for a second on this. This is the same Senate that just a week or so ago passed its first gun reform legislation in 30 years. And while their product was not nearly as far as the Democrats wanted to go, it was supported by no fewer, that gun compromise bill was supported by no fewer than 16 Republican senators, and that created a several vote safety margin that allowed the bill to exceed a 60 vote threshold. And so from my perspective, the gun legislation's passage demonstrated that even a bitterly divided Congress can come to middle ground agreement under some circumstances. And it is puzzling to me that Democratic leaders, particularly Senator Schumer, haven't displayed any interest along the same lines as they did on guns or on the question of abortion. And before the last pro-choice bill that was put up was defeated back in early May, Schumer completely ignored the compromise bill that would have been crafted by senators from both parties because he wanted to pass an all or nothing bill. Now, Schumer and his party's leadership wanted a bill that would outlaw all limitations on abortion before viability. And their bill eliminated all current state level restrictions. And so frankly, it was a much more expansive version of the law than Roe versus Wade was at that point. In other words, the bill that they tried to pass was what they wanted Roe versus Wade to be, rather than what it was. And you had pro-choice Republicans like Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, and in Manchin and others, who said, if you push for a bill that just codifies what was then existing law, we'll vote for it, but not an expansion of it. And so once again, a Senate that worked hard to come to a compromise that wasn't perfect for either side, you think there would be more of an effort to try to do the same thing on abortion, but there was not. So the logical question is, are there 8 additional Republicans who might vote for some partial level of abortion protections, less than Roe, but more than nothing? And the honest answer is that no one knows, because no one's tried. In my own opinion, whether you happen to be pro-life or pro-choice on this question, is if this is an effort worth making on gun control and gun ownership, it's one worth making here also. Okay, so we talked about Biden, and as I mentioned earlier, what he's talked about since a week ago Friday, in addition to the importance of the elections, is he's focused on these questions of transportation and access to medication abortion and other more ambitious alternatives that have come up. The administration's been fairly cool to. Several Democratic members of Congress have called for providing abortions on federal property in pro-life states, on military bases and other types of federal facilities. And the Biden administration has been cool to that, because they say that that could provide very difficult and dangerous legal exposure to both women and doctors once they leave the federal property in that state and return to the rest of the state where that state's jurisdiction would take place. So the question I have for you, given the importance of the transportation questions and the ability to travel across state lines, given the importance of access to medication and the other things that Biden talked about, is I think all of you know there's been a real debate in the Democratic Party about whether Biden is fighting aggressively enough or not on these issues. And given what we saw in our very first question, given how strongly the large majority of all of you feel about the Roe versus Wade decision, question for you, if we can post it, Claire, is, do you think Biden's doing enough to fight for abortion protections? And this is a pretty straightforward one, yes or no. And it's a challenge that Biden has faced on any number of other issues since taking office: climate change, immigration, and others, where the base of his party wants him to fight more aggressively. And the center of his party is urging him to take a more cautious approach, given the need to appeal to swing voters in the midterm elections this fall. So Claire, what does our group think about this as it relates to immigration? As it relates to abortion, yikes. Do you believe Biden is doing enough to fight for abortion protections? Very interesting. 34%, barely a third of our group, thinks he's doing enough. 66% say that he isn't, almost 2/3. And for those of you who'll be participating in our post-game program between 6 and 6:30 tonight, this is something I hope we can dig into, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on what else you think he could or should be doing. And for those of you who won't be coming, cheap commercial plug here, every month after our webinar concludes at 6 p.m. West Coast time, we host an additional 30 minutes for World Affairs Council Town Hall members, in which, rather than just submitting questions online, we get to have a back and forth conversation verbally. I really enjoy it. My impression is that those council members who do join it enjoy it also. And I hope it's something that more of you will consider doing in the future. It would be great to see you in that kind of discussion format. So one of the other questions that's been circulating, and I talked about this briefly also, is the question of suspension of the filibuster. And as we talked about earlier, Biden has called for a suspension in order to pass abortion protections. But again, he hasn't been able to move Joe Manchin. He hasn't been able to move Kyrsten Sinema. It doesn't seem likely at all. Now, the argument here is familiar because it's very similar to one that's been taking place for about a year and a half now about whether to suspend or eliminate the filibuster for other reasons. The argument in favor of it, which Biden is articulating on this matter, is it would, while not guarantee, it would greatly increase the chance of passing a bill that contained national abortion protections. The argument against it, which not only Manchin and Sinema, but any number of other Democratic senators more quietly, it's been reported, believe, is that by suspending the filibuster now, that would simply open up an opportunity for Republicans to do the same in reverse the next time that they control a majority of Congress. And Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, has warned precisely that. He said, think back to when Democrats suspended the filibuster for non-Supreme Court appellate judges some years ago. He said, I, Mitch McConnell, warned you all then that if you get rid of the filibuster for lower court judges, when we take over, we Republicans, he said, we could very easily do the same thing for Supreme Court justices, which of course he did. And what McConnell says now is, if you get rid of the filibuster for something that you Democrats think is a good idea, wait until we Republicans take over, he said, and see what my members and my majority will do on issues important to you, like immigration and abortion rights and other issues. So it's a really difficult issue. The prospect of passing legislation more easily is incredibly tantalizing, but the downside is that it works in both directions. So Claire, this seems to me like it'd be a good question to ask our group. What do you think about the filibuster? Do you believe the filibuster should be suspended to pass abortion protections? We're not talking about eliminating it altogether. We're talking about it suspending it specifically for this purpose. Although obviously, if you'd want to eliminate the filibuster altogether, you'd be a yes vote here also. But it is interesting, given that this is a topic of such debate in Washington and elsewhere, as to what our group thinks, whether a filibuster suspension would make sense or not. And Claire, do we have a response from them yet? Oh, this one's a little bit closer than some of the other questions we've been asking until now. 59%, almost 60%, almost 3/5, think it's worth risking the backlash in order to pass legislation now with 51 votes. And 41%, a little bit over 2/5, says that's not a good reason, either for the reason that I mentioned, or there's a certain number of people, including Biden on many issues, who simply think that that's not what the Constitution designated. So there've been other reforms under discussion. And this is something that's, this is an argument that started a couple years ago too, received much more attention and visibility during Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation hearings. Another reform that was talked about is expanding the court. Now, this is nothing new. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, as all of you know, tried this back in the 1930s when he was being frustrated by a then conservative court overturning some of his priority New Deal legislation. Roosevelt, as we all know, backed off, but there has been, it seems, increasing amounts of conversation over the last couple of years about whether a 6-3 court ought to be expanded in order to create more balance. And Claire, maybe we can see what our group thinks about that. All right. Do you believe the Supreme Court should be expanded to have more justices? There's currently 9, as we all know. There have been conversations about bringing it up to 12 or 13, to 15 or 18, and even more dramatic proposals to make the court even larger than that. Most of the impetus for this change, of course, is coming for those who do not support the current direction of the court, and recognizing that Justices Thomas and Alito are the oldest members of the court. Both are in their early 70s and could be on the bench for many years to come. Expanding the court would be some way of recalibrating its current ideological direction. And here we've got the results here, almost an even split. Half of our group, almost half, 49%, of our group does think the court should be expanded. 51% say no. And I must admit, as you know, I usually don't take sides on these things. This is for you guys to decide, not me. My own opinion is like the filibuster. If the court would be expanded under a Democratic president in Congress and they established a majority that way, well, then Republicans would do the same thing the next time they held the White House in congressional majorities. And if every time control of the executive and legislative branches switched, we added more justices, that Supreme Court would get very large and very unwieldy over time. Another option, which has received a great deal of attention and much more recently than the court expansion idea, is the idea of justices having term limits. And there's a number of proposals on this front also, but the most specific one would be to say that a Supreme Court justice, once nominated and confirmed by the Senate, would serve 18 years, at which point, if they chose not to retire, they could simply return to another position on the federal bench off the Supreme Court. And the idea being is, knowing that there would be a Supreme Court nominee every 2 years, that means every president, when he or she was elected, would know that they would have two Supreme Court appointments in their first term, and if they were reelected, 2 more in their second term. And much more than the court expansion, this one seems to be getting a much greater level of attention. And once again, we'd be interested here in what our group thinks of it. So Claire, if we can post the 6th and final question, do you believe Supreme Court justices should have term limits? And again, there's a lot of ways to do this, but what we're talking about in particular is an 18-year rotation that would give each president 2 appointments in each 4-year term. Admittedly, both of these are unlikely, but it's always interesting to begin the conversation, because even reforms that seem unlikely at the outset can build support and ultimately move forward. And so how about this one, Claire? How do we do on this? Okay, this one's a little bit less split than the court expansion. 91%, and as I think you could tell, I agree with you, 91% think that there's some benefit in this. And I like the idea, because I like the concept of a candidate for president saying specifically, if I am elected, I will appoint these 2 individuals to the court, eliminating the guessing game and allowing voters, although obviously they'll be considering other issues as too, to make a considered decision on this basis as well, on whether the Supreme Court justices who a candidate would put on the bench are those who they think would be appropriate to serve. Anyway, lots more we could talk about on both of those topics and plenty of other reforms. We haven't even gotten to the impact on the elections, and hopefully that's something we can talk about in the second half of tonight's program. But I believe that Rachel Kenderdine is going to join me now. And Rachel, let's see if we can start wading through some of the questions that our group has sent in. What do you say?
Yeah, hi Dan, that sounds great. So,
okay, I am ready when you are.
Perfect. So yeah, we have a ton of questions coming in. This is such an important topic right now. So to start, I know that you've spoken a lot about the opinion of Ruth Bader Ginsburg that abortion should be codified into law by Congress. So one viewer asked, has your reading suggested Congress has the power to pass a law regarding abortion? If so, under what powers that it has under the Constitution could it pass such a law that would stand muster at the US Supreme Court?
Okay, so 2 good questions there. And one, every legal and constitutional scholar that I've read does believe that Congress has that right. And once again, as we talked about in the first half of the webinar, the reason this conversation has shifted so quickly to state legislatures is because of the unlikelihood of Congress taking such a step. So in order for such a law to sustain scrutiny from this Supreme Court, though, the second question is a very, very smart one, because the right to privacy that the 7 justices asserted back in Roe versus Wade in 1973 is not acceptable constitutional reinforcement to this court. And so I believe that legislation passed either in Washington, D.C. or at the state level would almost certainly have to rely on the equal protection law, the type of gender equality considerations that Ginsburg talked about way back in the day. And this is not unique to abortion rights. By the way, we haven't talked today because there just hasn't been time. We haven't talked about the court's decision on gun ownership and the ability to carry a concealed weapon. It's worth noting that the court did not say this has to be allowed under every circumstance. Rather, it very specifically ruled circumstances under which it could not be allowed. And already we're seeing blue states like New York and California and others passing new laws to make it more difficult to gain a permit to carry a concealed weapon. And so if you think back to the original premise of the three branches of government and the separation of powers, the idea is the court doesn't make law, or shouldn't, but should rather instruct Congress as to what type of law is unacceptable, therefore allowing the legislative branch to move forward. So while this obviously hasn't been tested and almost certainly would be, that either Congress or a state legislature could, though, pass such a bill. And Ginsburg's guidance of equal protection is in all likelihood the best way that that could be accomplished and to sustain a judicial review.
Great, thanks, Dan. Another question that's come up a few times is Biden's role in his ability to really make a difference on this issue. So what can Biden do to make a difference without a true majority and with Manchin and Sinema restraining movement on other Democrat-led legislation?
Well, and of course, as you know, Rachel, we've talked on variations of this question almost since he took office back in January of 2021. And it's very clear, for understandable reasons, that a sizable portion of those who voted for him in 2020 I either don't understand or prefer to overlook the limitations he faces given such tiny congressional majorities. A 50-50 Senate with Vice President Harris to break ties and a single-digit margin in the House doesn't allow much margin for error. And while I am willing to give Biden some slack on this, I would also point out that he probably did quite a bit between the election and inauguration in 2020 and 2021 to raise people's expectations. Now, he ran for office, he ran for president as what he described as a transitional president, someone who seemed fairly committed to a centrist approach. And after the election, he began talking in terms of LBJ and Franklin Roosevelt level accomplishments. Now, both Johnson and FDR commanded immense Democratic majorities in Congress when they were passing their most ambitious legislation. Even if Joe Biden were just as talented a politician as either of them, he wouldn't be able to do that with these margins. And I don't think Roosevelt or Johnson would have been able to accomplish one fraction of what they did with the types of margins that the Democrats currently maintain. So the expectations are somewhat outsized, number one. Biden probably contributed to that, number two. And so at this point, my own feeling is that the transportation and medication questions are the types of things that his administration can handle through executive order. And I think talking about those in a much more aggressive way would be one step. But going back to what I was saying earlier about Congress, it seems to me that the president is uniquely positioned to go to Congress and say, look, I didn't think the gun bill was perfect. Far from it. Neither did most of you. But a certain number of you were willing to come together in order to provide some protections and not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think for the President of the United States to urge Congress in a very loud and public way that this is important enough to find ways to work together, I think that's something he could be doing. But the premise of the question is correct. He's limited in what he can do with such small majorities, and particularly in a midterm election year, the portion of the public that is not happy with this decision is looking for much more dramatic action than a president can provide at this point.
Yeah, and I think that the point that you brought up about transportation and travel, that's another question that we got a few times. So there has been a lot of conversation about how women will still be able to travel should they choose to get an abortion. Is the right to travel protected by the Constitution? And is that another area the Supreme Court could use to further restrict abortion rights? Or is that an area, like you mentioned, that could be remedied with an executive order?
Also a really good question. And in a very specific degree, this is unsettled law. The Justice Department would point to many other aspects of interstate travel where it has been ruled in the courts that the administrative branch does have jurisdiction. So they do have ample precedent to point to. But the premise of the question is exactly right. This is the type of thing that we argued in the court over a longer period of time. But I would say that given the urgency of the current situation for those who oppose the court's decision, taking a step like this, even if it's spent years being argued in the courts, would provide protections until Congress or some other actor on the political landscape could address it. So it appears that there's precedent for it. We don't know it, but even if this is a short or immediate term answer rather than a permanent one, it seems something worthwhile for a pro-choice president to want to pursue.
Great, thanks, Dan. So kind of shifting a little in focus, we've had tons of questions about the role of the Supreme Court and how this decision impacts other decisions that they've made. So I want to start with this question. Do recent Supreme Court decisions cast doubt on previous court decisions? And does this suggest the fallibility of the court? How can we trust future court decisions?
Right. So there's a few different questions in there. And any court decision that doesn't respect precedent, by definition, casts into question previous court decisions. Now, those who support the court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade point to previous decisions like Plessy versus Ferguson and Dred Scott as it relates to minority rights as previous acts of the court that needed to be overturned, and they believe the same about Roe versus Wade. Though when a justice, either appointed by a Republican or a Democrat, comes before Congress and is asked about controversial issues, they generally tend to indicate how much they respect precedent. And one of the strongest criticisms that's been leveled against the most recent, against the three Trump appointees, is the belief that they committed to respecting the Roe versus Wade precedent. And while ultimately this comes down to parsing words, it does appear that if you look very closely at what Barrett and Kavanaugh and Gorsuch said, at least publicly, we don't know what they said in private conversations with individual senators, but at least publicly, they indicated their very strong respect in precedent. They talked about the strong precedent that Roe provided, but none of the three said in public in their confirmation hearings definitively that they would vote to reinforce Roe. So to answer the questioner's first point, by definition, any decision that a court makes that overturns a previous decision calls into question that previous court's decision. Again, almost definitionally. On the broader question of trust, well, that's a more difficult one. And there's been nationwide polling done even before this decision 10 days ago that showed that the American public's level of trust in the US Supreme Court is much lower now than it had been in previous years. And that's even before the Roe decision. Now, the Supreme Court has plenty of company in that regard. Every American institution commands less respect and less trust now than it did in years past. And in fact, the only two institutions in America today in which more than 50% of the people say they hold trust are, number one, small business, number two, the military. Otherwise, there is no entity in the country today where more than 50% of Americans say they hold trust. So the court's not unique in that regard. But this is what John Roberts has been trying to do ever since he became Chief Justice. He sees, and he's talked about this publicly, he sees the court's role necessarily as an arbiter that has to be trusted by both sides. And so, for example, he did try to fashion a less dramatic compromise on the Roe decision. He made it clear some time back that he felt a middle ground could be achieved. And it's very clear that he's spent the last few months working very hard, specifically reaching out to Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett to convince them not to overturn Roe completely, but just like Republican justices did back in 1992 when they ruled on the Casey versus Planned Parenthood case, the wide expectation then was that they were going to overturn Roe because it was a majority Republican appointed court. And they didn't overturn it, but they narrowed it, and they included stronger restrictions. So Roberts has arguably dedicated his time as Chief Justice to try to maintain that level of trust for all the reasons that the questioner was talking about. The fact that he ended up on the short end of the vote in this one makes it clear that, at least for the foreseeable future, at least until Justice Thomas or Justice Alito steps down, this really isn't the Roberts court. It's the Kavanaugh court. And that Brett Kavanaugh becomes the swing vote, just like Anthony Kennedy and Sandra Day O'Connor and Harry Blackmun were in the past. And Roberts, as he's done on some issues, will work as hard as he can to pick off a fifth vote for a centrist solution. But it's going to be an uphill fight for him as long as these 9 justices are seated on the bench.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Dan. Kind of in the same vein with the Supreme Court, how do you reconcile the seemingly incongruous decisions that the Supreme Court has made with respect to pushing women's personal decisions to the dictates of the states without any federal protection, but at the same time ruling that the federal government can dictate the protection of conceal and carry?
Okay. Well, in both cases, and I'm not either attacking or defending the court in this conversation, just explaining in this context their line of thinking. They said, in both cases, these are decisions that ought to be made by elected officials. And frankly, it's the same line of thinking that drove their decision on that case relating to the Environmental Protection Agency's jurisdiction over greenhouse gases. Under all this is the idea that elected members of a Congress or a legislative body should act on these things. And while the particulars of the guns and the abortion decisions cut in different directions as it relates to the individual, in both cases, what the court is essentially saying, state legislatures have to come up, and this is in the New York gun case, they're saying state legislatures or Congress has to come up with more specific guidelines or restrictions on who can carry a concealed weapon and who can't, that the current guidelines as they exist in New York State are too vague. And similarly, they're saying, albeit for different reasons, attributing it to historical precedent, are saying that if legal abortion is going to be performed in this country, it's going to need to be done as the result of an act of an elected body. In both cases, the individual, whether the gun owner or the expectant mother, would be governed by the decision of the individuals who are elected to represent them in a state capitol or in Washington.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan. I want to hop out of the Roe versus Wade conversation for just a minute because
I'm guessing that we're getting questions on some of the other topics.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly. So on the topic of the January 6th congressional hearing, we had a question come in about the next steps of the Biden Justice Department. So this person asked, do you think that the current Justice Department will bring a criminal complaint against Donald Trump, given the evidence that they currently have?
Boy, as unsatisfying as this answer is going to sound, I believe that the decision will be determined less by legal considerations and more by political considerations. Ironically enough, that General Garland is so determined not to politicize the Justice Department, and that's a belief that President Biden holds as well, given what they felt was the case during the Trump administration, that they're going to be very, very reluctant to bring the Justice Department directly involved because it will be seen by so many as political retribution. And what the Democratic members, well, all of the members of the special committee on January 6th, not only the Democrats, but Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger as well have argued, is that the case against Trump is so overwhelming that the Justice Department has no choice but to take this on. And as evidence continues to build, Garland may come to that conclusion, saying, I'd rather stay out of this, but given the evidence that's been presented, I just can't. One possible option, which hasn't, oddly enough, at least in my opinion, hasn't gotten nearly as much attention as it probably deserves, would be, rather than Garland making the decision himself, and certainly rather than the White House making the decision, would be for Garland to appoint a special counsel. And there's ample historical precedent for this in the past under both Democratic and Republican presidents. And while the decision can never be completely depoliticized, if Garland were to appoint a special counsel to decide whether charges against the former president were appropriate or not, that doesn't completely protect either the Justice Department or the White House against charges of politicization, but it does offer a pretty good level of distance. And I do understand that ultimately these decisions do need to be made on the rule of law, not on politics. And I think even an attorney general who is devoted to defending the rule of law would be much better off deferring to a truly disinterested party, or at least a more disinterested party, so that it can be more likely to be decided on legal grounds rather than political considerations.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. We had also a question related to gun control, especially with the shooting yesterday in Highland Park, Illinois, at the July 4th parade. They asked, do you think that this latest shooting is enough to flip the congressional reluctance to pass significant gun control legislation, especially banning automatic and assault weapons?
Well, as we saw, the horrific shooting in Texas was enough, perhaps not to pass comprehensive gun reform legislation. But to be fair, it was the first gun legislation that had been passed by Congress in roughly 30 years. So while it wasn't nearly as far-reaching as many Democrats would have liked, and while many Republicans voted against it because they thought it went too far, it did represent a middle ground that allowed some progress to be made. And both Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, the primary sponsor of the bill, and President Biden said, no, this isn't good enough. This isn't enough. It's a first step. But we'd be extremely foolish, they both said, not to be willing to take some steps forward, even if we can't take all steps forward. Now, will the Highland Park shooting be enough to propel another piece of legislation on top of this one? As all of you have learned over the course of our years together, I gave up making political predictions in November of 2016. I don't know, but my guess is, particularly given even the broader and larger public debate over abortion right now, I feel like that because the Highland Park tragedy took place in such close proximity, the recent shootings in Texas, in Buffalo, and elsewhere, I don't unfortunately see a push for additional legislation, at least not yet. I don't think the bill that passed a week and a half ago will be the last thing Congress ever does on this topic. But I would be somewhat surprised to see them come back to it in a meaningful way so quickly. And again, as I indicated earlier a couple of times, it seems to me that if there is any appetite for a compromise on both sides of the aisle, that the opportunity do exist when it comes to abortion protections. And that while doing many of these things simultaneously is probably something Congress isn't capable of, if they can do one, I think there'd be greater public sentiment and greater political reward for doing something on abortion as opposed to taking another run at the gun issue right now.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Headed back to the issue of Roe versus Wade in the Supreme Court, just a couple more questions on that before we wrap up. But first, we had several questions come in on Roe versus Wade and how it relates to religious freedom, which the court has also kind of taken a stance on in recent weeks. So this viewer asked, in 2 states, Jewish groups have brought lawsuits against the state abortion laws being passed. Will the courts protect religious freedom or support their pro-life stance?
I've watched Jewish groups in 2 states. And of course, for those of you who aren't familiar with the details of the Jewish religion, my religion, the Jewish religion believes that a woman's right to an abortion should be protected. I don't think that argument is going to carry the day in state court. One, because both states in which the lawsuits were filed, not surprisingly, are states that are either have or are soon going to move aggressively to restrict or outlaw abortion. So I don't think the courts naturally are going to be disposed in that favor. And I think the rationale for that is going to be that while it disputes a tenet of the Jewish faith, that my guess is the court is either not going to consider it to be a sufficiently central tenet of Jewish religion and Jewish belief, or decide more likely that the burden it imposes is outweighed by what that judge is likely to consider would be the broader legal necessity. So they will in all likelihood consider it. And if I had to guess, which, as you know, I don't like to do, my guess is that both cases will be unsuccessful.
And then our last question also linkens back to the Supreme Court. So many questions about that today. But what are your thoughts on the independent state legislators' doctrine on the Supreme Court's docket next year and how it will impact future elections?
Boy, you know what we should do, Rachel? We should do another webinar later this year on next year's court docket.
Yeah.
Not only the question of independent states, but questions of affirmative action. Next year's court docket will be almost as high profile and controversial as this one. But very quickly, there is a legal theory which has now reached the court that state legislatures should have absolute decision-making power over any election-related decisions in a state. And I think even a court that tends to be very conservative would be somewhat skeptical of this approach, at least a majority of its members would be. And I suspect that Roberts, and in all likelihood, at least 2, if not all 3 of the Trump appointees would have a difficult time seeing that the term legislature, which so often elsewhere is used almost as a synonym for the people, could be given that absolute power, given the basic premise of checks and balances, the idea that an executive and a legislative and a judicial branch, both in state and federal government, do need to balance each other. Giving one of those 3 branches absolute authority, I feel, is something that could attract 2 or 3 Supreme Court votes, but in all likelihood, not 5. This is an incredibly complicated issue that we don't have time to satisfactorily resolve in the next 20 seconds or so. But Rachel, as we plan out the rest of the year, we ought to think about whether coming back and talking about the court at some point before the end of 2022 might be a good opportunity for discussing this issue and other things that they'll be facing in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Dan. And thank you so much for taking the time to answer these questions today. I know we had a lot that we couldn't get to, but we'll hit some of those on our continuing the conversation segment in the middle of the month. So if your question didn't get answered today, be on the lookout for it there.
Absolutely. So we'll get to at least a few more when we
Mhm.
post in a week or two. And then, of course, originally, Rachel, as you know, we planned to make this month's webinar about the January 6th committee hearings. Those look like those are going to continue for a while. The war in Ukraine isn't going anywhere. Inflation is going to be around for a while. Midterm elections. Kim, we've got more than a full slate to get us through the end of the year, don't we?
That's right. We're going to have to do more live streams and in person with you, Dan. There's just too much content. So thank you again for helping us all navigate through these crazy, challenging times. It helps a lot. I want stay on, Dan, while I let the group know, the audience know that we have a terrific live stream coming up on July 21st, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty with Ambassador Adam Scheinman. He's the special representative of the president for nuclear non-proliferation. And of course, August 2nd, the Dan Schnur political report, followed by his post-program discussion, which, as Dan said, gives you all an opportunity to speak directly with Dan. So consider becoming a member so that you get that up close and personal connection with Dan.
And I get to hear their questions and their insights directly rather than just reading them.
Yeah, Dan really enjoys it. So please consider that. On August 9th, we have a special member activity at the Skirball Cultural Center with a very special curated tour that Rachel just put up on the website today. So please take a look at our website, sign up for upcoming programs, and we can't wait to see you at the July 21st live stream, and of course, August 2nd with the Dan Schnur Political Report. Thanks, everyone. Take care. See you soon.
Thanks, everybody.